Okay.
Recording.
Hello viewers, this is Michael Miller, I'm your co-driver. This is Simon Wright, he'll be your driver. This is STPR 2014. Getting ready to start Stage 1, Waste Management 1, 8.88 miles.
The stage was delayed allegedly because the mail lady decided that she was definitely going to deliver the mail today on to some of the houses that were on stage. So she came in on a side road, got on stage, and we hear then a bus saw the mail lady, decided the rope was safe, and they got on, so they had to shut the stage down and sweep it again. So we're about at least maybe half an hour behind schedule.
Thank you.
That should be armed now.
Armed. It's going to be start 100 at left 5 minus. Go. 100, left 5 minus, to a right 4, into a left 5 minus over crest, 50, right 4 plus over small crest, slippy, left 5 long over small crest, slippy, 50,
Try not to count.
okay, sorry. Left 5 plus 50. Right 6, 50. Caution crest into turn right 2 minus over crest loose. $70 bumps through gate. Left 2 minus. 120. Left 4 plus over crest, no cut, 70. Turn right 2 minus 70. Small crest into left 5. Right 4 plus. Into a left 6, 70. Left 6 over small crest 50. Stay left over small crest. Left 6, 150. Left 5 minus long, tightens over crest. Into right 5 long over small crest 70. Stay right 5 plus long. Left 6 plus 150. Left 5 minus over crest, no cut, opens over small crest. Into right 6, no cut. Right 6 over small crest, no cut. Into crest 70. Right 5 minus opens long over small crest 50. Rough into caution, right 5 minus narrows. Right 5 plus short. Into left 5 minus slippy 70. Right 6 into right 3 slippy. Left 4 left 2 minus, no cut. Right 6, stay out. Into left 5, over small crest. Into right 4. Left 4 minus, slippy. 50. Long small crest over 70. 30 down, turn right 2.
That's a tree, you should have pulled it already.
That tree, sorry. 50, and then left 6 plus over crest. Right 4 minus, slippy 100. Small crest. Left 4 long, opens long. Into stay mid over small crest 70. Left 5, 120. Turn left 3, no cut. Small crest into turn right 2 plus 150.
Right 2.
Right 2 plus 150. Left 3, slippy. Crest 100. Crest into caution, right 4, off camber, long over crest. Caution, right 4 minus over jump, tighten, slippy. Left 5 plus over crest 50. Right 2 minus. Into right 3 over crest.
Big rock. Next.
Left 2 long, hug into slippy. And right 3 minus, extra long over crest. Right 3 long, slippy 50. Left 2 off camber long, opens long.
The left 2 up here.
Yeah, this is our left 2. Long, opens long. Into a small crest.
Next.
Into left 4 minus over crest. Opens and tightens 3 over crest. Right 3 minus 100. Stay left over crest into right 4. Left 3 plus 50. Caution, slippy into turn left 1 plus. Into turn left 3 minus. Into right 4 plus opens. Left 4 minus short over crest. Into right 3 minus slippy. Left 4 minus over double crest. Into slippy. Into right 3 plus 6 over crest. Into left 3 over crest. Into right 3 plus. Left 4 plus over crest off camber. Into right 5 over small jump. Into left 4 late. Right 3 minus. Next 50. Caution, turn left 2 plus over crest. Left 5 minus over crest, down, opens. Into caution, jump. Into right 6 over bumps. Left 6 over small crest. Into right 5 minus slippy. Opens, tightens 3 plus. Into left 4 plus short. Into right 4 over small crest.
Next, we got a left something here. Left 2.
Left, this is left 4 plus.
No, this is the left 2 or 1. And a right 3 up.
Okay, into crest 30.
Yep.
Left 5 plus short over small crest 50. Right 2 minus over crest deceptive.
Very good. Next.
Into left 5
Next.
right 3 no cut. Opens 100 slippy. Left 5 plus. Left 5 minus off camber over small crest. Into right 2 slippy. 3 over crest. Right 4 minus off camber. Crest 70. Right 4 off camber. Into left 5. Into a right 5 minus 70. Right 5 minus short into turn right 2 plus. Left 5 minus to a right 3. Right 3. Yep, caution, left 3 plus, tightens 3 minus. Into a right 5 long, tightens 4. Small crest 70, turn left 2 minus loose. Right 3 plus, okay. 50. Turn left 3 minus, narrow through gate. Right 4 plus short, into left 5 minus over small crest, 70. Caution, turn at left 4 long over jump and dip 150. Small crest, to a left 4 plus over small crest long. Into left 6 plus over 300 over triple small crest 120. Right 6 plus 50, caution jump.
This is the jump.
This is your jump. After that you have a 50, left 6 plus over small crest 180. Okay. Left 6 plus over small crest, good, 180. Stay right over small crest 70. Caution, turn left 2 plus 50. Stay right over small jump 70. Right plus opens, very long 70. Small crest 50. Caution, turn left 2 minus narrows. Into a right 2 plus long down tighten slippy 50. Right 5 minus short 70. Right 6 long 70. Right 5 plus long slippy. Tightens 4.
5 tightens 4.
5 tightens 4 long slippy. Into crest, into left 6, 200. Caution, right 3 slipping.
Right 3 down there.
Right 3 slippy into a left 2 plus short. Kinks 120. Right 4 short, into a caution, left 2 short, slippy. Into a right 3 short plus, into a right 3 short, into left 2 plus. Right 2 into left 3, tightens. Into a right 3 minus. Into a left 2. 50. Right 1 plus, slippy. Into a left 3 plus. Right 3 short 50. Left 3 plus off camber. Into a right 3 plus. Left 6 50. Right 4 short into left 3 slippy. Into a right 2 plus. Into a stay left over jump. late. Caution, right 6 short into turn left 1 plus. Right 5 plus over small crest, long, tightens 4 plus over crest.
Get ready for the
Long
button.
over finish.
Get ready for the button. Woo!
Good job.
Woohoo!
Caution 100.
Give me 5.
Awesome. Well done, sir. Yes. Yep, I sure do. Thank you.